We left last week with the expulsion from England of the Jews. Ron Aronson and I were talking earlier today, and he asked me a good question. He said, "What about Shakespeare? He wrote about Shylock." There is no evidence, no solid evidence that there were any Jews in England until Cromwell, which is few decades after Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice. And while I have been handed from time to time an article about a secret Jew here and a furtive Jew there living in England, I can't find any there's certainly no evidence of a community. And if Shakespeare knew any, which I would highly doubt, that would be a surprise, I think, to most historians. It doesn't mean they didn't know about Jews. They knew all the stories. And they knew that Jews existed in other places in Europe from time to time. Who had a question? Kathy, you have a question. Go ahead. Yeah, you can just push your space bar if you have a space bar. We can't hear you though.
Hold your space.
You have to hold it down. Still not working.
What year was it when the Jews were expelled from England? I
can tell you the year and the date, at least according to the Julian calendar. It was the 18th of July, 1290. And while we're not going to read their expulsion order, we are going to look in a few moments at the French expulsion order, and if we get to it today, the Spanish expulsion order. But we have a major detour to take to Spain first, because the conditions there were different. We're going to actually get away from the expulsions. And although, let me make one more comment, because I believe it was David who asked me in an email about the official versus the popular anti-Semitism. The two were quite intertwined with each other. And the reason being that popular anti-Semitism, if you will, it existed at different layers and levels of society for different reasons. We've seen that the English situation, which was not unusual, had a lot to do with the finances of the aristocracy. This is why they were egging it on. And that ultimately the creation of the popular anti-Semitism, which had to do with their personal financial situations, which were seriously deteriorating due to the debts they owed to Jews, that could be exploited to spread to the hoi polloi, the masses. And the masses were easily swayed. They had grown up for a very, very long time hearing the stories as they're portrayed in the New Testament, which we studied. We looked at the blood cry in Matthew. So they were a ready audience for this. And if you could create this kind of animus, which wasn't so hard when there were really no other minority communities in Europe, you only had the one, and they were the one that was, by their mere existence, defying your religion, your sacred beliefs. Well, that's the one you were going to take on, but they would take them on for different reasons. Today, I want to start out with the systematic persecution, by which I mean, to the extent that we can call it this, the government's role. Now, understanding how government was organized in those days requires a major shift for us, because, for instance, we know that there were the papal powers, and there were the monarchic and other aristocratic powers, depending on where you lived. If you lived in Germany, there was just a hodgepodge of them, although there were some states that were much larger than others. If you lived in France, it was mostly a unity kind of government, we might say, more or less. There were certainly disputes on the edges. Spain was its own thing because it was in a constant state of flux owing to the Arab conquest, the Moorish rule there, which we're going to talk about briefly. And then England, which was more or less kind of a unity in England by this time. It had not been, but there were still many disputes with Scotland, and of course, Ireland was its own thing, but that's not within the realm of our discussion of anti-Semitism. So monarchies were growing stronger, I think is my main point, and frequently coming into conflict with Rome. But they, on the issues of the Jews, it operated differently in different places, and that had a lot more to do with local Christian authorities. It had a lot more to do with whether the official policy of Rome was being followed. And that's where we're going to start today, is the official policy of Rome. Having already now spoken for 7 minutes, that's where I say we're starting, right? So in the medieval times, in these medieval periods, as you remember, there were restrictions on Jewish life and religious practice that had been set out by the Romans in their legal codes. Well, those were inherited by the Holy Roman Empire, meaning the papal power structures, which added further prohibitions on fraternization between Jews and Christians and so forth. But there was a line, and the line was an important line. It was both in place for religious and theological reasons, and also for the very practical reasons that we spoke of before. With no financial structure in place that Christians could gain access to, how can you lend money when you can't charge interest? You needed the Jews to do that. Now, the halakha, Jewish law about interest between Jews, is not what we're talking about. We're talking about halakha, Jewish law about interest between Jews and others. The law says you're not supposed to be usurious. I'm sure there were usurious people, and that's, neither here nor there. It still didn't justify what was done to them. But in any case, for the popes, while that practical consideration was very much in their sights, it's not what they addressed. So we're going to start today's, because this is it's very much a textually based class. I want to share with you some of the documents here. Hopefully I've got the right one. Do I? Yes, I think I do. If you all are seeing something that says medieval persecution on the top, then I have succeeded in mastering, at least for one day. It says medieval Europe systematic persecution, Pope Alexander III, papal bull. All right. There were a number of these, what are called papal bulls, which is just another way of talking about an official papal declaration. These can be binding or they can be guidance. It just depends. They were first set out when it came to Jews in 1120 by a pope that I know nothing about other than his name and that he did this, named Calixtus II. And it was, as they all were, a kind of papal charter of protection. And the reason that Calixtus chose to issue this papal bull was because of what had happened in the First Crusade. So the bull forbade Christians, on pain of excommunication, from forcing Jews to convert, from harming them, taking their property, disturbing their celebration of festivals, interfering with their cemeteries, and so forth. So was this because the popes were so philo-Semitic? Was this because they were so in love with the Jews? Not really. This was a way of sort of supplementing the protection they gave them by a number of, because they had the practical reasons for it, and some of those practical reasons were even theological. And they would do this regularly. The first one I think was in Latin. They were always in Latin, called Sicut Iudeis, this letter of protection. They would frequently reissue them because attacks on Jews were so common. And the one I want to share with you today is very similar to the first one, but it was shorter, so that's why I wanted to share it. It was issued by Pope Alexander III in the, I want to say the 1160s. I don't have an exact date on it. I should have written that down. I just wrote when he was the Pope. So what does he say? And we'll take it apart a little bit. The Jews ought to suffer no prejudice. We, out of the meekness of Christian piety, and in keeping in the footprints of our predecessors of happy memory, the Roman pontiffs Calixtus, Eugene Alexander Clement, admit their petition. The Jews came asking for this. We grant them the buckler of our protection. For we make the law that no Christian compel them, unwilling or refusing by violence, to come to baptism. But if any one of them should spontaneously and for the sake of the faith fly to the Christians, once his choice has become evident, let him be made a Christian without any calumny. Now, you'll see later there's another reason we're reading this too, because this kind of changes among Christians. Indeed, he is not considered to possess the true faith of Christianity, who is not recognized to have come to Christian baptism, not spontaneously, but unwillingly. It's a theological issue. You can't be a Christian if you don't come to it willingly, supposedly. 2, no Christian ought to presume to injure their persons or with violence to take their property or to change the good customs which they have had until now in whatever region they inhabit. This was something that was required not only by the Jews to do business, but also by the aristocracy, the monarchies. They needed the Jews to have some sense that they were safe. And it wasn't all the Jews. There were poor Jews, but remember at this point, we're talking about relatively small Jewish communities. Besides, in the celebration of their own festivities, no one ought to disturb them in any way with clubs or stones. You don't make a statement like this if it wasn't happening. And that's another important thing to remember as we read it. Nor ought anyone try to require from them or to extort from them services that they do not owe, except for those who have been accustomed from times past to perform. We decree that no one ought dare to mutilate or diminish a Jewish cemetery, nor in order to get money to exhume bodies once they have been buried. This was becoming widespread, to raid Jewish tombs. If anyone ever, however, shall attempt the tenor of this decree once known to go against it, let him be punished by the vengeance of excommunication, unless he correct his presumption by making equivalent satisfaction. Excommunication was a pretty powerful punishment. It meant you didn't go up to heaven. In 1199, we have another papal bull. And the reason I included this is because it reminds us how they viewed the Jews. And this is what they were being taught about them. Although, and this is Pope Innocent III in 1199, so it's not terribly long time after the other one. Although in many ways the disbelief of the Jews must be reproved, since nevertheless through them our faith is truly proved, they must not be oppressed grievously by the faithful, as the prophet says, and this has nothing to do with Jews. This is simply something in the Bible, the Jewish Bible, by the way. Do not slay them lest they be forgetful of thy law. It is talking about Jews there, but the whole Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, is about Jews. So everything it says is about Jews, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And yet we read it, every week in synagogue. But what's important to see here is that there's a way of looking at the Jews as being living symbols of what rejection of Christ brings. So he goes on to say that here's an interpretation of this psalm, of whoever wrote this psalm, the prophet, he just calls him, that it is as if to say more openly, do not wipe out the Jews completely, lest perhaps Christians might be able to forget thy law, which the former, although not understanding it, present in their books to those who do understand it. The Jews have preserved this law and they don't even understand it, but by their mere living, we are reminded where it came from. So, we serve a purpose and a theological purpose. Even though the Jews ought not to presume to go beyond what is permitted them by law in their synagogues, and they did censor Jewish services. They sometimes refused to allow Jews to say certain things. So in those which have been conceded to them, they ought suffer no prejudice. And that would have been a reference right there to money lending, because that was one of the things that was most strongly permitted to them. And it was one item on a decreasing list of things that Jews could do. Because we know, for instance, in France, from the time of Rashi to this time, landowning became impossible for Jews. We know that Rashi had land, and within 4 or 5 generations, that wasn't allowed anymore. These men, therefore, since they wish rather to go on in their own hardness than to know the revelations of the prophets and the mysteries of the law, which all predict Jesus as far as they're concerned, and that's how you have to read this, and to come to a knowledge of the Christian faith, still, since they beseech the help of our defense, we, out of the meekness proper to Christian piety, and in keeping in the footprints of our predecessors of happy memory, a whole list of popes, admit their perdition, and we grant them the buckle of our protection. It is all framed, as the first one was, as they all are, in Christian piety. But we see here what it's really about. Okay, from here, in our little, very, very short examination of what the official Christian position was, again, more observed in the breach than in reality, because they wouldn't be talking about all these things if they weren't a problem. It's one of the reasons, when we study Bible, that we know that the very, 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 very ancient Jews were polytheistic, right? Because the prophets are consistently telling them to stop being polytheistic. And archaeology has confirmed that. Well, here it's a completely different place. But when you see these kinds of documents appearing over and over again, you get a good idea that this is what's happening. And the Jewish documents, the few Jewish things that we have preserved from that time, we don't have a lot except holy books. They do attest to it as well. In 1215, the church issued what was called they held what was called the Lateran Council, and they issued this decree. And it begins to remind us about how they also felt about Jews. We decree that such Jews of both sexes in every Christian province and at all times shall be marked off in the eyes of the public from other peoples through the character of their dress. And we don't really know if they ever did this, but we do have art attesting to it. This is the origin of where the yellow badge came from in Germany under the Nazis. The idea that Jews had to show something that differentiated them from others. Even though in many of the portrayals of Jews in art, and I'm going to share some art with you in a moment, we are depicted as being, kind of hook-nosed and maybe more swarthy and all those kinds of attributes that they put upon us. The truth is that, and DNA has shown this, that while Central European and later Eastern European, because that's where they came from, while we absolutely have a strong blood connection, DNA connection to people who came out of the area of Israel, there's no question about it, especially from DNA, our mitochondrial DNA, that's the one you only get from your mom, right? That's in your stomach helping you digest. It's all I can remember from that biology class about that. And maybe one book that Richard Dawkins might have done about Darwin. But I do know that that's where it comes from, and that it attests to not 100%, but the presence of Central Northern European women having been in our line. I forget what the DNA is that you only get from male lines. Certainly the Cohen have a marker, the Kohanim, believe it or not. Apropos of a conversation that Kathy and I had, Kohanim all over the world have a marker that other Jews don't have, one DNA marker. But we've got some of that too. That's why you get some blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jews. For that matter, the Crusades is where you get blonde-haired, blue-eyed Arabs. And we had one once at our temple. She was part of a panel we had of Arab Americans and talking about what it's like for them in America. And this was the blondest, most blue-eyed, light-skinned person I've ever seen, but she was Arab. People mix, and that's just how it is. And that meant that it was hard to tell Jews apart from other Europeans at times, very frequently. You couldn't just look at us to know, not by and large. Now, we all know there are people who in our stereotypes, you look at them and they look more Jewish than other people, right? The European Jewish, Ashkenazi Punim. But when you put them next to other Europeans, that begins to break down, and it becomes harder for you to say that one's Jewish, that one's not. And this is how people sometimes were even saved during the Holocaust. They could hide the children or what have you. So the idea of placing some kind of characteristic clothing or patch or hat upon them, that would have helped you to figure it out. By and large, you shouldn't have needed it very much. And that's why we question whether this was sort of um, maybe done in a few places, maybe not done at all, maybe only is something that they really did in artwork. We don't know. We don't have any photographs, and we don't have any of these things extant today. But they certainly were worrying about it in 1215. They go on to say some other things too. Moreover, during the last 3 days before Easter, and especially on Good Friday, they shall not go forth in public at all. And this is, the old joke that I keep telling. It's not a funny joke. It's one of those jokes that Jews tell each other. How do Jews celebrate Good Friday? How do they celebrate Easter? And that's something that probably at some point people have asked you, how do you celebrate Christmas? How do Jews celebrate Christmas or Easter or whatever? Just out of ignorance. And that's where the joke arose from, that they sit in their basement and cower. But here you see in the 12th Lateran, the 13th century Lateran Council, which they're basically saying you can't go out in public. That may have been for their own damn good too. It was not the time you wanted to go out, especially when the Gospel of Matthew, which is so prominent in the Passion plays, which are still a problem, by the way. They were huge in Germany, the Passion plays, but in many other places too. And some have argued that, even Jesus Christ Superstar is a kind of a Passion play. Why he had to pick that particular gospel as the main one has always been wondrous to me. I don't think they're anti-Semites. I think they just thought that told the story in the most dramatic way. But it's a pretty anti-Semitic gospel. It's the one with the most participation in the Sanhedrin, Pontius Pilate's most denials, the blood upon us and upon our children, all of that is there. So we shouldn't go forth in public for all, for the reason that some of them on these very days, as we hear, do not blush to go forth better dressed and are not afraid to mock Christians who maintain the memory of the most holy passion by wearing signs of mourning. I also doubt that. If anything, it may have been that during a time, and it was not infrequent now, when Passover and Easter cross over, as they do because of the way that the calendar is determined by the Christians every year, which sort of mostly keeps them together. They're very far apart this year because we have a leap year, a Jewish leap year, which, as you know, adds a 13th month. But probably the Jews were wearing fancy clothes for their own holiday. In any case, over time and in various places, Jews were more and more marginalized, and this is attested to and factual, forced to live in separate streets or areas of towns. More and more, especially as the communities grew from tiny communities to larger ones, excluded from pretty much everything that was part of mainstream society. Certainly the guilds were completely closed to them, meaning that they were primarily merchants, moneylenders, frequently ran pubs and lodges and inns, not only frequented by themselves, but by others. Later in Eastern Europe, when many of these restrictions will be reimposed after having been lifted or non-existent really in Eastern Europe, they'll mimic some of this. And so you might even be familiar with this from your own Eastern European Jewish parents, grandparents, what have you. The ghetto, in fact, the very word ghetto comes from, for example, a place that was not an enormous Jewish community, but Venice, where that word was strictly used to describe the places where Jews could live. Under this manorial system that was developing anyway, very few people could own land. But of course, the guilds made a difference too. There were also those, and this really helped their popularity, who were employed by feudal lords or later by the medieval monarchs or otherwise aristocratic people to collect the taxes and the rents. And I'm sure you're aware, throughout that entire medieval into much later periods, the amount of of taxes and rents combined could really impoverish farmers who, what just happened to my, oh, there we go. Farmers who worked the land that was not owned by them, that was owned by the knights and the people who became aristocrats. So in addition to this, within the Middle Ages, there was an increase, as we saw, in the false accusations. These were easy to believe because most peasants couldn't read. They had no education. The only place they really would sit and gather and listen to stories was church. And aside from all the scary stories about them having to behave or they would go to hell, the most entertaining stories were about the Jews. And of course, all the old stories were about the Jews too. Anything in the Tanakh, of course, is about Jews, and they knew that, and the Jews don't always come out so great there. All right, we're going to take a little break here to show you now what those churches looked like and what the art, which was primarily viewed in churches that they saw, was teaching them about these stories. This is the wrong place. I pushed the wrong button. Share screen. Here we go. Okay, so this is a little bit of a slideshow. Can you guys all see it? A little bit of a slideshow. So we talk about, again, the pointed hats. And here are the pointed hats. This is a collection of Jews. This is a medieval picture, I think, going back to the 1300s. I know I wrote it down somewhere, showing Jews with these pointed hats. Now, did they ever wear them? We don't know if it reflects any reality, but it's how they wanted them depicted in the art, and it may be that that was what it was limited to. Another popular badge was the yellow circle, and this is where the Nazis got the color yellow from. The Star of David as a symbol of Judaism does not yet exist, or at least is not yet widespread. Nobody's exactly sure where that came from, but I can tell you for a matter of fact that David, who was the king for whom the Star of David is named, never saw this star used in his name. It may have been on the shield somewhere. I don't know. Nobody knows where it really came from. But the yellow is definitely in these costumes and these patches, at least in the art, it seems to have been reflected. Again, we don't have photographs, so we don't know, were people really doing this? Was it really necessary when they were so segregated? This is really the kind of art that most Christians were, especially the peasantry, was mostly exposed to. They did not have art museums for them. The great art was usually in public buildings that were grand public buildings for the aristocracy, or much, much more commonly in private homes and collections, because the people who were the patrons. It's only been relatively recently that we've been able to go and look at this kind of stuff outside of people's homes. But in churches, you would see this all over the place. Now, this has, I'm not an art expert. I could take a couple art appreciation classes. This is Jesus being nailed to the cross under the direction of the Jews, and the Jews are over here being depicted with their special hats on. And this here is a depiction of two Roman guards playing dice, shooting lots for him, which was taken. It's placed in this story in the Gospels, but it was really taken from something in Psalms. And then here's the Romans and others, and they're doing that. Okay, here is a depiction of, again, this may have been in a Bible or some book, so it might not have been something seen popularly. Come on. Seen popularly, but this is Jesus being brought before Caiaphas, who is the high priest in at least one or two of the Gospels, expect me to remember. And you see how the Jews are depicted, right? And they have the weird hats on. Here's the high priest. He's got this weird hat. And you know that these things were always, they had no sense of history and changing. So everything that's drawn in the Middle Ages is always drawn with the idea that they wore the same clothes 1,000 years earlier as the people were wearing. That was really common, by the way. I just don't know some Hasidic Jews or Haredi Jews who think they're dressing. I think I told you the story about that Chabad kid, little kid who went to my JCC preschool and was highly insulted when I commented he was dressed up like a Hasidic adult. And I said, "Oh, you look just like Daddy. You're just like Daddy or Abba." And he said, "No, I'm just like Mordechai." And so his father had been teaching that Mordechai wore a black hat and a black coat. And not only that, but Chabad style, which is kind of New Yorky 1940s. They don't have payas and they don't have tzitzit hanging out the same way. But here, look at Jesus. Could he look more Gentile? And look at the Jews here with the hook noses, all of them with the hook noses. So this is what they would see. This was probably a woodcut in a book, but very common. Here's an illustration that they would have seen in church, maybe in a Bible that was open for people to look at, from the book of Psalms. Remember, they didn't read the Bible even. It wasn't even translated into their own languages. But in the book of Psalms, and this, by the way, a book for Jews, by Jews, about Jews, but once they got their paws on it, talk about cultural appropriation, they would read things the way they wanted to read them. There's a very famous psalm. It's even in the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book, that says, "The fool says in his heart that there's no God." And here the fool is the Jew, the drunkard Jew. Look at the nose, you see the typical kind of thing. This is probably from the 1300s, guessing by the depiction. And here is the Gentile who is taking the permission to whip him, but ever so lightly, I suppose, because he's a fool. Now, this is something you may not have seen or noticed, but if you've been to medieval churches, it's there on dozens of them. Notre Dame has such a one as this. This is what's called ecclesia and synagoga. So what is ecclesia and synagoga? Ecclesia means the church, and synagogue obviously means the synagogue. This is often depicted as the church ascendant and the synagogue descending, but it is also based upon the sisters, Rachel and Leah. So remember how Rachel is beautiful and fair of face and Jacob's beloved. Jacob ironically changes his name to Israel, so Rachel is really a matriarch of the Jews, but so is Leah. She's the mother of many more tribes than Rachel. Rachel only gave birth to 2 tribes, Benjamin and Joseph. Joseph is actually the father of 2, so we could say 3. But she is typically depicted with a cross, ahistorical, but it doesn't matter because it's really about her being ecclesia, looking up or outward. The synagogue, this is the Bible. It's almost dropping from her hand, as you can see. She's almost like letting go of it. She's looking down, and notice that she's blindfolded. And she's not blindfolded in the sense that we blindfold the icon of justice. She's blindfolded the way Leah was blind. Leah's eyes were dim. She had bad eyesight. And so, like Leah, the Jews cannot see the very truth that is in front of them. The very truth that is that Jesus was sent by God to forgive all Jews. If only the Jews would recognize that. And this is very much at this period of time a religious issue. Later, we're going to look at the racialization of the Jews, which is not as late as you think it is, but which has not been the primary force behind this anti-Semitism in the same way that, for instance, it was when Tacitus spoke about it, or Appian spoke about it, and 1 or 2 others that we read. So this one happens to be from the portal of the Strasbourg Cathedral, very large. This is now in a museum, and the originals are in a museum, and the one in Strasbourg is replaced by replicas. Here is another one, the statue of the synagogue. And notice that here the synagogue, in addition to having her eyes covered, the book dropping from her hand, but here they make it very clear that it's the tablets of the covenant. She's dropping them from her hand. She has a staff because she's lame. She's not able to walk properly. And the hat with the little pointy thing on the top, the Jew hat, covers her eyes. And I think she might have there, I don't know, it's a little bit hard to see, and I can't enlarge it. I think she may have something over her eyes too. So this is, once again, this is at Notre Dame. And I'm sure it's being restored. Here's another one in Chartres. And this is in in obviously a stained glass. I didn't have a clear picture of it, but here she is again. The book is dropping from her hand. She's got a sort of crooked cane in her hand, the covering of her eyes, but also there is a snake here. This is the snake with arms and legs. Remember, the snake had arms and legs in Genesis. Who has caused the blindfold. And the snake, of course, the serpent, is representative of sin. Okay, now we've talked about the various blood libels. Now we haven't met Martin Luther yet. We're going to spend some time on Martin Luther, probably next session or the one after that, because Martin Luther was a horrible anti-Semite, but he didn't start out that way. But this happens to be from what's called Martin Luther's Church in Wittenberg in Germany, and it's a depiction of yet another blood libel. This one very similar to William of Norwich, but it's a German version. And he was a boy who disappeared from Trent, and I don't know if he was real or not. The one William Norwich seems to have been real. And the murder was blamed on the leaders of the city's Jewish community. These tales, they just went everywhere. This is already the 15th century. I haven't gotten into, but I'll mention it now. The Black Plague, which of course affected Jews and Gentiles equally, and which was the worst plague, one of the worst plagues in human history. I mean, it decreased the population by, I think, half or more in England and other parts of Europe. The Jews were blamed for that, of course, poisoning the wells. I mentioned it in another place. I don't have a depiction of it, but it's along these lines. They found a dead body, perhaps in the cellar of a Jew's house. We don't know. And of course, they tortured the Jews. And then on the church, because Martin Luther learned to hate the Jews. At first, he fell in love with them. He thought they were going to be the best examples of how true his own theology was, because they'd all follow him. And then they didn't. And we'll read about what he did then after that. But here they are, just slicing this little baby's open, the little throat open, collecting the blood here in this little spoon or whatever it is. I guess they're going to make matzah out of it, and it's called the blood libel of the murder of Simon of Trent. Here's something very interesting. I mentioned it, I think, very early on in the class. I may have mentioned it on the evening I talked about anti-Semitism rising on the left, and it is absolutely a trope that is making a reappearance of Jews as animals. One of the most popular of these was the Judensau in Germany. This is on the Wittenberg Cathedral, the same one where the other depiction was. This is right on the cathedral outside. The Judensau is, and you find it in a lot of places, the sow of the Jews, is a folk art image of Jews who are having some kind of obscene sexual contact with a female pig, which of course is the most unclean animal in Jewish tradition, culture, law, whatever you want to say it. It began to appear sometime around the 1200s in Germany. It popped up in other European cultures. It's still around. In Nazi Germany, classes of German school children were sent to see the Judensau on German churches. It is still an insult that Germans will say to each other. I don't know how popular it is anymore, but my understanding is that Judensau is not unknown. And here you see Jews suckling them. You see a guy playing with the genitals. It's a lovely image to put on your church, right? And it became 600 years now. Here, of course, is one of my favorite of the blood libels, just because it is so ridiculous that when I teach it to some people, once you've heard about it, you get it. But when I teach it to some people, the laughter is such that they don't believe it. But this is the host desecration. You recall I talked about this a little bit at another time. I don't remember when. This is the blood libel that whose victim is a cookie. And what is the cookie? It's the host. Now, I remember visiting a Catholic church and rabbinical school. I tasted the host, but only the unconsecrated one, which is just a wafer. They won't let you have the consecrated one, and I didn't want it. But I had some friends who were in my class who would not even eat the unconsecrated. I wanted to know what it tasted like. It tasted like nothing. Anybody ever try it? No, see, all the Jews here, you never did it. But yeah, the priest was giving us a tour and he pulled it out. And he said, don't worry about these. They're not in the nave, so you don't need to worry about them. Nobody's blessed them yet. They're just they're just cookies. They're just wafers. But Jews are said to have gone into the holy receptacle that they keep it in and to steal it and then to torture it. Sometimes they were depicted as tying it up, sometimes as putting it on a cross. Here you see they're just stabbing it. I don't know if you can see there's blood running out from it here. It's a little bit faded, but there's the blood. There's blood all around it. So, I don't know. I never got to touch one that was consecrated. So I don't know if I would break it in half. It would scream. They said that we enjoyed the screaming of the host. You don't bite them or chew them. You sort of let them dissolve in your mouth. And they do. The one at least I had kind of dissolved in my mouth. And here they are again having this is in Passau, having a host desecration party. Stole a whole bunch of little Jesus cookies and they're stabbing them. And I don't mean to make light of this, but I mean, this is the kind of ignorance we're talking about. And it's just horrifying. How many of you have never heard of this? Russ, you all were okay. So, all right. So most of you, all right. A few of you didn't. A few of you did. Some aren't on camera. Now, this one you're familiar with. This is the famous Michelangelo's Moses. So when I first taught this class, somebody brought this up when I did this little slideshow. This was not in my original slideshow. I didn't have it in there. And the reason I didn't have it in there is because there's not clear evidence whether Michelangelo did this because he wanted to say that Jews had horns. Now, we know that there were already satanic images of Jews. We heard about it, we read about it from the book of Revelation, the synagogue of Satan and so forth. But those are early things, and they're not necessarily reflective of the kinds of demons that we're used to thinking about today. And it's never been very, very clear whether or not this was meant that way. So then you ask, well, then why would they be there? Well, it happens that in Hebrew, the word Karen, which means array, also means horn. Now, there are other words for horn, but it is one of them. And it says in the book of Exodus that after Moses went up and met God, that it says, Karan or Karan or Pnei Moshe, that his face, the face of Moses, karaned, and it's used as a verb. So what does that mean? Did they become horny? Horned? Horned, I'll say horned. Did they become horned? Or did they become full of rays? Was it the face from which rays were coming out? There are some non-Christian, some Jewish depictions that show, even very ancient ones, that show rays that kind of look like horns. And I've even seen that in completely non-Jewish art. I've seen that in manga and other Eastern art, where rays and horns kind of look the same. So the argument is that when St. Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, which became the official Catholic Bible, that he translated it as horns around Moses's face. And they wouldn't have just been two up here. They would have been all around. And I just read an article saying that even ancient Near Easterners sometimes said that when you got those kinds of horns, it was something that connected you to God. I have picture after picture of things from ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and all these kinds of places, ancient Persia. There's been a lot of debate about this, whether this was Michelangelo being anti-Semitic or demonizing Moses and therefore all the Jews. St. Jerome, we know he didn't love the Jews. We know exactly what he felt about them. We know the imagery already of the synagogue of Satan from the book of Revelation, but still, it is not at all clear whether this was something that was meant to be anti-Semitic. So I'm going to leave you with a lot of ambiguity on that, but I will, however, give you one last Michelangelo piece. So this is from the Sistine Chapel. And when they were cleaning it, which wasn't so long ago, On the panel, there's all this panel of all these biblical, some of them very obscure characters in the Bible. They're not necessarily unknown to me and others who read the Bible a lot, but they are obscure to most people today. And this one happens to be a print about Aminadav. Aminadav was he was the first guy to jump into the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, if you will, when the Pharaoh's chariots were chasing. And so he's considered a bit of a hero in the Torah and to the Jews. Some people in their Haggadahs, in modern Haggadahs, talk about them. When they were cleaning it, they revealed, because it was so schmutzy, they revealed that there was a yellow circle on his cloak. And so this gives some further testimony to whether or not they were really being asked to wear different clothes. I don't know if the hat is any different. It does have a little point here, kind of like flopping over point, like a witch's hat. But there is definitely that circle there, and that is from Michelangelo's time, and on an indisputably Jewish character named Aminadav. Okay, so let's go back to our texts, and we're going to read on a little bit now. So actually, I'm not going to keep the text on right now because I don't have anything to go with that. So we're going to take a little detour, and then we'll go back again to, do I want to do that? No, we're going to keep this on for 1 minute. I want to read one thing to you. Sorry about that. I moved one thing in front of another in my notes, and I don't want it where I put it. Let's just talk about, did I give you the right one? No, now you're looking at my notes. Okay. You don't want to, that's all the stuff that's going to be on the test. So you don't want to get in trouble for that. Come on, where's my, there it is. Okay. Before we go where I want to go next, which is to Spain, I do want to look at another expulsion. So we never read an expulsion decree when we were talking about the Jews of England, but I do want us to look at an expulsion decree now, and this is the one from France. So let's just take a minute to read it, and then we're going to move on to Spain. This is a depiction on a tapestry, I believe. And see, they have the circles, by the way. They're all wearing the circles, so that's how we know we're Jews. This is King Philip Augustus of France, pointing the way out of the country to all the Jews. And you see a mixture of, some of them look like regular people, I guess. But this guy here, he's got quite the nose. And the ones who look like regular people, ironically, they have the yellow circles on. And this was in 1186, I think. So the Jews were actually expelled and then unexpelled in France. They would go back and forth on this sometimes, but this was a big one in 1186. Philip Augustus had often heard that the Jews who dwelt in Paris were wont every year on Easter Day or during the sacred week of our Lord's Passion to go down secretly into underground vaults and kill a Christian as a sort of sacrifice in contempt of the Christian religion. That's why I put it here, because of the blood libel connection. For a long time, they had persisted in this wickedness, inspired by the devil. And in Philip's father's time, many of them had been seized and burned with fire. St. Richard, whose body rests in the Church of the Holy Innocents in the Field in Paris, was thus put to death and crucified by the Jews, and through martyrdom went in blessedness to God. Okay. By the way, they were acquitted by Louis VII, but that's not important. Because the most Christian King Philip inquired diligently and came to know full well these and many other iniquities of the Jews in his forefathers' days, therefore he burned with zeal. And in the same year in which he was invested at Rheims, probably saying that wrong, with the holy governance of the kingdom of the French, upon a Sabbath, that would be a Sunday to them, the 16th of February, 1180, by his command, the Jews throughout all France were seized in their synagogues and then despoiled of their gold and silver and garments, as the Jews themselves had despoiled the Egyptians at their exodus from Egypt. This was a harbinger of their expulsion, which by God's will soon followed. So this is all 100% accurate description of what led to the expulsion of the Jews. At this time, we're talking about 1180 to 81 now, a great multitude of Jews had been dwelling in France for a long time past. We don't know what a multitude is. It's something over 100,000. That's all we know. There were no censuses. But, the population wasn't that large anyway. So they've been dwelling in France for a long time past, for they had flocked there from divers parts of the world. They grew so rich that they claimed as their own almost half of the whole city. And here once again, we get into the Jews controlling everything, the Jews owning everything. This is the one thing that sticks with us. It doesn't matter if you hate the communists, it's the Jews are in charge. If you hate the capitalists, it's the Jews that are in charge. We're always in charge. It's amazing. We're 0.2% of the entire world's population, and yet we somehow run the whole thing. And if you look at with these anti-Semites who are, supposedly pro-Palestinian, which they're not, they don't know a thing about Palestinians. Their idea is that the Zionists, which is their euphemism for Jews, run an empire the size of who knows what. In one interview, I saw someone going up and down the line at one of these protests, asking people if they knew. They were chanting about the river to the sea. What river, what sea? I won't even tell you the hysterical answers they gave, but one of my favorites was, and they were so sure, the Black Sea and the river on the other side of Gaza. I mean, how do you find the energy to go stand in line outside and chant for 2 hours about Palestine will be free from the river to the sea when you think it's the Black Sea and the Gaza River? The Gaza River. There's no Gaza River, by the way. I made a joke last night. They were protesting and holding up the Academy Awards. And I wrote this joke, so it's copyright me. I said, well, that's good. They not only did they hold up the start of the Oscars, but they did manage to free Palestine from the LA River to the Salt Lake Sea. So it's part and parcel of the demonization of the Jews. But let's go back now to the 1100s. Finally came, oh, here we go. They grew so rich that they claimed almost half the city and had Christians in their houses and men servants and maid servants who were open backsliders from the faith of Jesus Christ. And it is true that Jews, when they could, were able to employ people who were Gentiles until it was forbidden. Finally came the culmination of their wickedness. Certain ecclesiastical vessels consecrated to God, the chalices and crosses of gold and silver bearing the image of our Lord Jesus Christ crucified, had been pledged to the Jews by way of security when the need of the church was pressing. The church borrowed money from the Jews. They used these so vilely in their impiety and scorn of the Christian religion that from the cups in which the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ was consecrated, they gave their children cakes soaked in wine. That's the, when they consecrate the wafer, that's the body and blood that's the body of Jesus, but the wine is the blood. And that's what they were doing with these chalices. In the year of our Lord's incarnation, 1182, in the month of April, which is called by the Jews Nisan, so this is Passover season, an edict went forth from the most serene king, Philip Augustus, that all the Jews of his king should be prepared to go forth by the coming of Feast of St. John the Baptist, June 24th. They had to leave by then. And then the king gave them leave to sell each his movable goods before the time fixed, that is the Feast of St. John the Baptist. But their real estate, and here it's apparent that they still own some, at least in this part of France and Paris, that is houses, fields, vineyards, barns, wine presses, and such like, he reserved for himself and his successors, the kings of the French. So there is, by the way, some suspicion that much of this wealth probably wound up being used to build the Louvre. Okay. So this is where we're going to stop today, because to start another chapter right now would be a little bit silly. We're going to look next week. We're going to go to Spain, and we're only going to spend a little bit of time there, but we want to be there because it's important for us to understand what happened in Spain. And Spain, believe it or not, is the place where we see a sort of transition from the theological dislike of the Jews to really a much more, I would say, what we would call almost racialized anti-Semitism. And the racialized anti-Semitism becomes apparent particularly because of the mass conversion of Jews in numbers that we cannot really define. But we do know that, and and we're going to look at the document, we do know that in 1492, once the Reconquista, which was the reunification, as the Christians saw it, of Spain under Christian rule, with two monarchs who joined together, two reigning monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who, when we were children, we mostly learned about them sending forth Columbus. But what for Jews was important, that the same year they decreed that Jews must either convert or leave. But what happened in the wake of the conversion was a new kind of anti-Semitism, because it seems that much of the Inquisition was focused upon Jews because of their insincerity and because of what was known as their lack of limpieza de sangre, cleanliness or purity of blood. And that's where this begins, or let's say resumes, because we saw it in antiquity. So we're going to talk about the special situation in Spain. Much of it, especially after the Reconquista started, and in the Christian area, is looking very much like what we've been studying here. And we're not going to talk much about, if anything, about the Golden Age, because there wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism in the Muslim Golden Age. But that was only a couple of hundred years, and it didn't take long before Muslims came up, and things were pretty hard for the Jews. Not for the same anti-Semitic reasons, just because they weren't Muslim, they were seen as allied with the Christians, all that kind of thing, ironically. And we'll talk about where the Jews went, and then we're going to move to Eastern Europe ever so briefly, and back to Central Europe. And this is going to be, I think we have 3 to 4 more sessions, depending on how fast I talk. And then we're going to take a break until, and it'll take us right up to about, maybe a couple weeks before Passover. I don't know. So stick with me, and then we'll take a break until next year, because that's usually been my thing. This is a Passover. There's usually a big break in the Monday classes from Passover to Sukkot or Simchat Torah, so that I can, prepare some new classes. So because these take a while. All right. Anybody have any questions before I conclude? Well, if you don't want them on the recording, that's fine. I'm going to conclude the recorded portion of our class, and if you want to hang out for a few minutes to talk about stuff, we can. Thanks for coming, everybody.